By the beginning of 1944, Europe had endured nearly 5 years of war, occupation, and fear. Entire nations had disappeared from the map. Governments had collapsed. Borders meant nothing anymore. For millions of civilians, daily life had become a quiet battle for survival, finding food, avoiding suspicion, and hoping not to be noticed. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The Axis powers were no longer expanding. They were defending. Across the Atlantic, the United States had transformed itself into an industrial giant. Across Britain, armies were gathering. And in the East, the Soviet Union was pushing back with relentless force. The question was no longer if Europe would be liberated. It was how, when, and at what cost. This is the story of the liberation of Europe, not as a single event, but as a long, brutal push forward, measured in miles, lives, and decisions that reshaped the modern world. Occupation was not the same everywhere, but its effects were universal. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, German authority reshaped daily life. Food was rationed. Travel was restricted. Radios were confiscated. Curfews were enforced. In Eastern Europe, occupation was harsher. Entire communities were destroyed. Forced labor became routine. Mass executions were used as tools of control. Resistance existed everywhere, but it came at a terrible price. A single act of sabotage could lead to an entire village being burned. A hidden radio could mean imprisonment or death. Families learned to live quietly, cautiously, and without trust. Liberation, for those living under occupation, was not a political concept. It was survival. Liberating Europe required more than courage. It required planning on a scale never seen before. The Allies understood one truth clearly. Germany could not be defeated by bombing alone. Ground forces would have to fight their way back into Europe. Years of preparation followed. American factories produced tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ammunition in staggering numbers. British ports expanded to handle endless supplies. Training camps prepared millions of soldiers for combat they had never experienced. Every decision mattered. Where to land, when to strike, how to sustain armies once they crossed into enemy territory. This would not be a single battle. It would be a campaign stretching across an entire continent. Before liberation could begin on land, the skies had to be controlled. Allied bombers targeted factories, rail networks, bridges, and fuel supplies deep inside occupied Europe and Germany itself. The goal was strategic paralysis. Without fuel, German tanks could not move. Without railways, reinforcements could not arrive. Without factories, weapons could not be replaced. Fighter pilots fought daily battles for air superiority. Losses were heavy on both sides. But by early 1944, the balance had shifted. The Luftwaffe was weakening. Allied aircraft increasingly dominated the skies. Liberation was becoming possible. On June 6, 1944, the liberation of Western Europe began. D-Day. Under cover of darkness, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Many missed their landing zones. Some were killed before reaching the ground. Others fought isolated, cut off, and surrounded. At dawn, thousands of ships approached the beaches of Normandy. American, British, and Canadian soldiers stormed ashore under heavy fire. On some beaches, defenses collapsed quickly. On others, especially Omaha Beach, the fighting was brutal and chaotic. Men died within minutes of landing. But by the end of the day, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible. They were back in Europe. D-Day did not liberate Europe. It opened the door. What followed was weeks of grinding, exhausting combat in the hedgerows of Normandy. German defenses were deeply entrenched. The landscape limited movement and visibility. Every field became a battlefield. Progress was slow. Casualties mounted. Supplies struggled to keep pace. Soldiers fought in close quarters, often without clear direction. Finally, Operation Cobra broke the stalemate. American forces punched through German lines, allowing Allied armies to surge forward. The War of Movement had begun. As Allied forces advanced, France began to rise from within. Resistance fighters sabotaged rail lines, cut communications, and guided Allied units through unfamiliar territory. In August 1944, Paris was liberated. The moment was historic and emotional. Crowds filled the streets. Flags returned to public buildings. Years of occupation ended in celebration. But beneath the joy lay deep wounds. France had suffered, and the war was far from over. After France, the Allies advanced rapidly across Western Europe. Belgium and Luxembourg were liberated. German forces retreated, but not in collapse. The speed of the advance created new dangers. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Fuel shortages slowed tanks. Ports had to be captured intact to sustain the push forward. The Allies faced a dilemma: advance quickly and risk overextension, or slow down and allow Germany time to regroup. That decision would shape the rest of the war. In September 1944, the Allies attempted a bold plan. Operation Market Garden. Airborne forces would seize key bridges in the Netherlands. Ground forces would race forward to link up with them. The goal was to bypass German defenses and end the war before winter. The plan was ambitious. It failed. German resistance was stronger than expected. Communication broke down. Airborne units were isolated and overwhelmed. The war would continue into 1945. Liberation was not a simple moment of joy. In newly freed cities, people faced difficult realities. Food shortages continued. Infrastructure was destroyed. Families searched for missing relatives. Some collaborators were punished harshly. Old wounds resurfaced. Freedom came, but so did responsibility. Europe would need to rebuild itself from ruins. While the Allies pushed from the west, the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. Their campaign was massive and relentless. Entire armies were destroyed. Cities were leveled. Millions were displaced. The Red Army liberated concentration camps, exposing horrors beyond imagination. By early 1945, Germany was being crushed from both directions. The liberation of Europe was now inevitable. As Allied forces crossed into Germany, the war entered its final phase. Cities were bombed. Transportation collapsed. Civilians fled. German leadership refused to surrender. The fighting continued, even as defeat became certain. Liberation now meant invasion. In December 1944, Germany launched a final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Allied forces were caught by surprise. Cold weather, snow, and shortages pushed soldiers to their limits. But the line held. When the offensive failed, Germany had exhausted its last reserves. The Rhine River was the final major natural barrier. In March 1945, Allied forces crossed it. German resistance collapsed rapidly afterward. Cities fell one after another. The road to Berlin was open. In April 1945, the war reached its climax. The Soviet Red Army entered Berlin. The city became a battlefield. Adolf Hitler died in his bunker. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Liberation came at an enormous cost. Millions of soldiers and civilians were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered. Victory did not erase suffering. It ended the fighting, nothing more. Europe emerged liberated, but divided. The West aligned with the United States and its allies. The East fell under Soviet influence. The Cold War began almost immediately. The liberation of Europe solved one conflict and created another. The Allies did not liberate Europe in a single moment. They pushed forward step by step. Through fear, sacrifice, and uncertainty. The liberation of Europe was not just a military victory. It was a human one, and its lessons still matter today.